Tonight, you'll hear about the most remarkable financial and image resurrection in pop culture history and get a rare look at what Michael Jackson left behind.
There are things in this world that powerful people never want found, not because they're dangerous, not because they're illegal, but because once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And once the world sees them, everything shifts. The story you thought you knew quietly rearranges itself into something you weren't prepared for. For years, the name Michael Jackson carried two very different weights. One was a legacy music movement, a kind of magic that hadn't existed before and hasn't existed since. The other was a shadow. Accusations, trials, headlines that split people clean in half. Some believed, some didn't. Most just held their breath and waited for something to finally make sense. Then the FBI opened the vault. Not a metaphor, an actual vault, files sealed for decades. Documents, photographs, and materials that investigators had quietly gathered over years of surveillance. Materials that were never meant to reach the public. And when those files finally came to light, the world expected one thing. What they found was something else entirely. Because the question was never just what was inside those files. The deeper question, the one that lingers long after the reading is done, was what those files said about us. About how we watch famous people. About how we judge them. About how easily a story gets shaped before we ever get the chance to think for ourselves. This is not about guilt or innocence. It never really was. This is about what happens when the curtain finally drops, and what it means when the truth turns out to be far more complicated than any headline ever prepared you for. Before the investigations. Before the trials. Before the media turned his life into a spectacle watched by billions, there was just a boy from Gary, Indiana, who could move in a way that made people forget to breathe. Michael Jackson grew up in a house where music wasn't a hobby, it was survival. His father, Joe Jackson, ran the family with an iron hand and an eye for commercial potential. The Jackson 5 were performing on stage before most of the children were old enough to understand what a stage even meant. Michael was the youngest performer and almost immediately the most captivating one. There was something in the way he carried himself, even at 9, 10, 11 years old, that felt ancient. Like he had already lived 1,000 performances before this one. Like the spotlight had always been his, and being away from it was the thing that felt unnatural. By the time he released Thriller in 1982, he wasn't just famous. He was a phenomenon. The album sold over 66 million copies. The music video redefined what music videos could be. Children who had never heard of him watched that 14-minute short film and walked away genuinely changed. Adults did too. He was everywhere, on every radio, in every living room, and somehow that everywhere still felt earned. But fame like that doesn't just change your life. It changes the very architecture of your existence. The people around you, the way strangers speak to you, the widening gap between who you are in private and who you are in public, it all shifts. For Michael Jackson, that shift happened early, and it never really stopped. By the late 1980s, the questions began quietly. Tabloids printed rumors. His appearance changed in ways the public couldn't stop discussing. He purchased a sprawling estate in California he named Neverland, a place with a private zoo, carnival rides, and an open-door policy for children who came to visit. At the time, some people saw it as remarkable generosity. Others found it difficult to fully explain. Most couldn't quite decide what to do with it, so they filed it away and moved on. That ambiguity, though, never left him. It followed him through the 90s, through his marriages, through the birth of his children, through everything. And then in 1993, it stopped being an ambiguity. It became an investigation. A 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler made allegations against Michael Jackson that shocked the world into silence before it erupted into noise. Jackson denied everything. A civil settlement was reached out of court. No criminal charges were filed at that time, but the shadow had arrived, permanent and impossible to ignore. And quietly, without any announcement, the FBI had already been watching. People forget that the FBI's involvement with Michael Jackson didn't begin with a tip or a formal complaint. It began, according to reports and documents that later became public, with something far quieter: a pattern. A pattern of associations, of movement, of relationships that investigators felt needed to be tracked methodically over time. The FBI maintains files on thousands of individuals. Celebrities, politicians, activists, criminals, the list is longer than most people ever realize. In Michael Jackson's case, the file that eventually became available through Freedom of Information Act requests runs to hundreds of pages. The sheer volume of it tells you something significant before you read a single word. What the documents reveal in their earliest sections is surveillance in the purest sense of the word. Not dramatic wiretaps or sudden raids, but careful, methodical observation. Who was he meeting with? Who traveled alongside him? What were the financial patterns flowing in and out of Neverland Ranch? Investigators were building a picture slowly and deliberately, the way all pictures are built, one careful stroke at a time. What's striking about the earliest portions of the file is not what they contain, it's what they don't. There is no single definitive moment. No witness who steps forward with a confirmed, unambiguous account. What there is instead is a portrait of a man living at the precise intersection of extreme wealth, extreme fame, and extreme isolation. Someone who seemed, in certain revealing ways, to have very little understanding of how the world outside perceived him. People who worked alongside him during this era, producers, choreographers, longtime musicians, have spoken about the way Neverland functioned. It wasn't sinister on the surface. If anything, it was overwhelming in its generosity. Children from underprivileged families were brought to the ranch. Parents were given access to the rides, the animals, the private cinema. Michael himself would often spend hours with visitors, talking, playing, watching films late into the night. But what investigators were asking, quietly, patiently, without rushing toward any conclusion, was whether that generosity had a purpose beyond what it appeared to be. According to the files, no conclusive evidence emerged in this early period to definitively answer that question, and that absence in itself became part of the story. Because the FBI doesn't commit to watching someone without reason, and they don't keep watching without something continuing to hold their attention. The 1993 allegations changed everything, not just for Michael Jackson, but for the investigation that had been building around him. According to released documents, the FBI deepened its involvement significantly following the very public accusations made by Jordan Chandler's family. The case drew international attention almost overnight. News cycles ran without pause. Interviews, legal commentary, and opinion pieces filled every available platform. The public was consuming the story faster than facts could be verified or contextualized. In the middle of all of it, Jackson sat before cameras and spoke directly to the world. He said he had never harmed a child. He said the accusations were false. He said the entire investigation had been motivated by money. His hands shook slightly as he read from the prepared statement. His voice was steady but hollow in the way that voices get when someone is holding themselves together through pure, exhausting discipline. The civil case settled for an amount reported to be in the tens of millions of dollars. Jackson's side maintained that no admission of guilt was made. His legal team described it as a practical decision, that continuing the lawsuit would have consumed years and energy during a criminal trial that the district attorney ultimately chose not to pursue. At that time, but the FBI files, according to the investigators and journalists who later reviewed them in detail, tell a more layered story. Because the settlement didn't close the investigation. It complicated it. Law enforcement continued gathering information. International connections were examined. Reports from multiple countries were collected and filed. What emerged from this section of the vault was not a confirmation of guilt. What emerged were questions, dozens of them, that had no clean answers attached. Inconsistencies in accounts. Witness statements that pulled in opposite directions. A web of relationships so dense and interconnected that even experienced investigators, according to what has been reported, struggled to map it with any clarity. The case that the world assumed was finished was not in any meaningful sense finished. It had only gone very quiet. Some of the most revealing material in the FBI files doesn't involve any single document. It involves something more architectural, the picture of Neverland Ranch itself that emerges slowly and cumulatively across hundreds of pages. Neverland was not simply a home. By any reasonable measure, it was a controlled world. 2,700 acres of California land, a private railway, carnival rides, a zoo housing giraffes and chimpanzees. A movie theater stocked with thousands of films, staff who lived on the property year-round, security cameras, a perimeter designed quite clearly to ensure that what happened inside stayed inside. That level of deliberate insulation is unusual for anyone. For someone under active federal scrutiny, it raised questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. According to documents made available through public records requests, investigators spent considerable time examining the physical layout of the property, gathering staff accounts of what daily life actually looked like, and reviewing the access protocols that determined who could enter which areas and when. Some portions of these findings remain partially redacted to this day. Others reveal details that received very little attention when the files were first released. What comes through, reading carefully between the lines that have been blacked out, is a portrait of a man who had constructed around himself a reality so complete, so fully sealed from ordinary friction, that the outside world almost never reached him in any meaningful way. No one said no to him easily, no one challenged him without consequence. He existed in the truest and most literal sense, surrounded by agreement. Psychologists who study the long-term effects of extreme fame and isolation have observed that this kind of environment doesn't simply protect a person from criticism. Over time, it distorts their sense of what is normal, what is acceptable, what is visible to others. And that distortion, according to several reports, may help explain some of the behavior that later became the center of trial testimony. Not excuse it, explain it. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and it matters here. The FBI files don't offer a psychological profile. But taken together, the documents quietly sketch a portrait of someone living so far outside ordinary human constraints that even genuinely well-meaning behavior could drift across lines he may never have recognized as lines at all. In 2005, the world watched Michael Jackson stand trial on charges that were serious and detailed. The evidence, according to prosecutors who spent months building their case, was significant. The defense, led by attorney Thomas Messereau, dismantled it methodically, piece by careful piece. The trial stretched across months. Testimony came from dozens of witnesses. Jackson appeared in court each day, sometimes looking frail, sometimes arriving late in a way that caused the assembled press to erupt into a low, sustained roar. The jury deliberated. And in June 2005, they returned a verdict across all 14 counts. Not guilty. The reaction split along exactly the lines the public had always been divided. Some people celebrated. Some were devastated. Some went very quiet and tried to work out privately what they actually believed. But this is precisely where the FBI files become significant, in a way the courtroom verdict never could. According to investigative reporting on the vault's contents, the evidence collected by federal investigators was not fully introduced at trial. Some of what the FBI had gathered, materials from international investigations, legally obtained correspondence, and testimony from individuals who were never called to the stand, remained sealed throughout the proceedings. Not because it was considered irrelevant, but because of the complex jurisdictional and procedural rules that govern what can and cannot be used in a state criminal trial. This is not unusual in federal investigations, but it is deeply unsettling when you sit with the implication. It means the trial the world watched, the one that produced that sweeping not guilty verdict, was not the complete story. It was a single chapter. And the rest of the book remained locked away in a vault that most people didn't know existed. What was actually in those remaining materials? Investigators who have spoken privately without attribution have suggested the picture they paint is not simple. It doesn't clearly condemn. It doesn't cleanly exonerate. It sits in that difficult, uncomfortable middle space that most real investigations actually occupy, and that most public narratives flatly refuse to acknowledge. What the vault confirmed, quietly, without fanfare, was something the trial could never quite manage. That absolute certainty in cases like this one is almost always an illusion that we construct because uncertainty is too hard to live with. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. The cause was acute propofol intoxication, administered by his personal physician. He was 50 years old. His death did not close the investigation. In some important ways, it reopened it. In the years that followed, new accusers came forward. Documentaries were produced, books were written, former associates gave long, detailed interviews. The FBI files, portions of which had already been made available to select journalists, attracted renewed and serious attention. And the public, which had already decided what it believed, was forced to reckon with the possibility that those beliefs had been formed on information that was never complete to begin with. The post-2009 materials in the vault, documents added and updated following his death, are among the most debated and least publicized sections of the entire file. According to reports from journalists who have reviewed portions of them, they include communications between investigators across multiple countries, assessments of materials discovered at Neverland after his passing, and ongoing evaluations of claims made by individuals who had never come forward during his lifetime. What no one seriously disputes is that some of what investigators found was genuinely disturbing, material that carried no innocent explanation. Material that, according to those who have described reviewing it, was deeply difficult to sit with not just legally, but as a human being trying to make sense of it. And yet the legal reality remains unchanged. Michael Jackson was never convicted of anything. He died a free man. His estate continues to generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually. His music still plays on every continent on Earth. Children who were not yet born when he died know his songs by heart and feel something real when they hear them. That paradox, the gap between what the files quietly suggest and what the law was ultimately able to prove, is not unique to this story. It happens far more often than we acknowledge. But it rarely happens at this scale. It rarely happens to someone this famous, this loved, this genuinely complicated. The vault didn't destroy a legacy. But it complicated one permanently and irrevocably. And perhaps that was always the most truthful thing it could have done. There is a question that lives at the center of all of this. It doesn't have a clean answer. It may never have one. What do you do when someone you genuinely admired, someone whose work moved you, whose talent was undeniable, whose presence shaped entire decades of culture, turns out to also be a person who may have caused serious harm? You don't have to resolve that today. You may never fully resolve it. Most people won't, and that is not a failure. That is what it looks like to sit honestly with complexity. What the FBI files represent, more than any single revelation they contain, is the gap between public truth and documented reality. The gap between what we are shown and what was actually recorded. That gap exists inside almost every major story we think we understand. Investigations are never as clean as verdicts make them appear. Evidence is never as simple as the headlines that summarize it. People, even people capable of extraordinary, genuine beauty, are never as simple as the narratives we build around them to make ourselves feel settled. Michael Jackson was many things simultaneously: a genius, a deeply damaged person, a product of an industry that consumed him before he was old enough to protect himself from it. A man who, according to many accounts from people who knew him closely, never fully developed a normal understanding of where personal boundaries lived or why they mattered. Whether that makes him something to be feared, or something to be grieved, or some impossible combination of both, that is something courts, investigators, and thoughtful people have spent decades trying to honestly determine. No verdict has satisfied everyone, no documentary has closed the conversation, and perhaps none ever will. The vault didn't hand the world a final answer. It handed the world more questions. And perhaps that is the most honest result anyone could have genuinely expected from it. Because the full truth about Michael Jackson, the complete, coherent, settled truth, may simply be something we never get to fully hold. What we have are pieces, testimonies, documents with entire paragraphs blacked out, a jury's unanimous decision and a filmmaker's accusation, and 1,000 conflicting memories from 1,000 people who were all, in their own way, telling the truth as they understood it. What we do with that uncertainty reveals something about us. We live in an era that is deeply uncomfortable with open questions. That wants people sorted cleanly into categories: hero or monster, innocent or guilty, worth celebrating or worth erasing entirely. But human beings resist that sorting, even the most public ones. Even the ones whose entire lives unfolded under the brightest, most unforgiving light imaginable. The vault opened. What it held was not a verdict, it was something closer to a mirror. And the hardest part, the part that stays with you long after the reading is done, isn't looking at what's inside it. The hardest part is catching your own reflection on the glass. If this story left you sitting with something, a question, a feeling, something you can't quite put words to yet, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. These are the kinds of stories that don't resolve neatly. They stay with you. They ask you to hold discomfort without rushing to make it simple. If you have thoughts or a perspective that feels worth sharing, leave it in the comments. This is a conversation worth having carefully and honestly, with people willing to think rather than just react. And if you want to keep exploring stories told this way, with depth, without noise, without easy answers, then subscribe. There is more here waiting for you. Take your time with it.